back to the Shock Absorber, and thank you for listening, whether you are on YouTube or listening from your favourite podcast app. I'm laughing a lot, guys. We're laughing a lot today, but it's welcome back to the original setup. Stu, hello.
Hello.
It's great to have you on again.
It's great to be here.
Is it?
Yes.
As always. In the Third Space studio. And Tim as well, welcome back.
Thank you.
Same noisy jacket as last week, I noticed.
Yep.
Does it come out in the recording?
I don't know.
A little bit last week, but
Right.
it was barely noticeable.
That's
Unless you were watching it on YouTube, where you would have seen you moving your arms in a weird manner.
Wild and wacky.
Yeah, wild and wacky.
I like
Yeah,
that
that's
phrase,
me.
wild and wacky.
That's how I would describe Tim.
Yeah. Yeah, and lots of people have.
Ros calls you wild and wacky.
Does she?
Yeah. I've heard her say that. Tim, you're so wild and wacky.
Ros is Tim's wife, we should say.
Yeah, that's
just to
true.
make that clear.
Clear up any confusion.
Well, if anyone knows, it's Ros, so I think
Defer
we'll
her
defer to her. Yeah, that's right. 100%. Welcome back, Stu. Haven't been on the last couple of episodes.
No.
It's been real lovely to have you on. Do you want to do cultural artifact or
Yes.
where you went to into northwest New South Wales? Which one would you prefer to talk about first?
Oh, well, I think if we've got time, it'd be good to throw in both. But I could start off with Collarenebri. We travelled up to Collarenebri to a river convention. Some of our viewers and listeners would be familiar with that phrase. Back in the early 2000s, our dear friend Isaac Gordon and his wife Eileen invited us up to northwestern New South Wales to participate and be on their team for gatherings that travelled around different outback towns out in New South Wales, where we'd have fellowship and meetings, and we'd sing and hear a talk, and people would give testimonies, and it was a really awesome experience. We called them the river conventions because all the towns out in northwest New South Wales were on certain rivers, and so Isaac and Eileen led us in that. Isaac's a Aboriginal pastor out in Brewarrina to this day, and we've now had a 20-year relationship with them and have been incredibly blessed by going out to meeting Aboriginal people right across New South Wales, and Collarenebri was the latest opportunity to go and have fellowship with our friends up there. So the good news is some of them are coming down to Sydney in the next couple of weeks after a week away. So if at all possible, we might be able to get one of our friends on the podcast actually to talk a bit about Aboriginal ministry and Aboriginal youth ministry that's going on in Brewarrina. So that'd be a really good thing to do. But yeah, we had a good time. It was the biggest convention I've been to. There was over 100 people a week a meeting actually. We met over a weekend, and at each of the meetings there was over 100 people, and people recommitted their lives to the Lord, and people made fresh commitments to Christ, and it was just a really awesome time. I went up there with Tim Anderson, and he's from Soul Revival Church, and we had a really good time. Yeah,
that's cool. And just so if anyone doesn't know, it's up near the border of New South Wales and Queensland.
Yep.
But it's probably from where we are at Kirrawee, and I did a quick Google Maps saying 8 hours and 8.5 hours. But I feel like that's probably if you're driving, consistently.
Yeah, if you don't stop. Yeah. It's about 11 or 12 hours. Yeah.
What's the ideal way for you to get going on the road trip?
As many people
You got
ask
a
this
playlist
question.
or?
Yeah, there's the best is to get someone to talk to and have a good conversation.
Yep.
Or podcasts. I love history podcasts, so I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's a really good podcast I come across called the Shock Absorber podcast, which
Not a bad one.
I've had a listen to it. Yeah,
I've subscribed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're just listening to yourself most of the time?
No, I'm just joking. No, I just really enjoy meeting new people and hanging out, and I've got huge music collection that I really love. That's all on Spotify now, actually. So all that money I spent all over those years on music was kind of redundant.
Moot.
Yeah, so a bit moot. But anyway,
Sorry to bring that up.
Yeah, as I think about it, I think, wow, could have done better not to buy all that stuff, all those records.
Well, you weren't to know.
No, not at all. And you listened to it and you enjoyed it at the time. But yeah, podcasts are good. I really, actually, all jokes aside, I really like The Rest is History by
I enjoy that
Tom
too.
Holland.
Yeah, you got me onto that.
What's the other guy on
Dominic Sandbrook.
Yeah, that's a great podcast. I
Who
love
I believe they're coming out
They
They
are.
are,
Too.
aren't
Yeah,
they?
we should go and watch them. Yeah. Wonder if we can get Tom on the podcast. That'd be pretty cool.
Oh, that would be pretty cool. We could ask him.
He probably wouldn't even open the email.
No.
No, I think you sell yourself short, but anyway.
There you go. Never know. Never
May as
know.
well
My favourite episode of his podcast was one on pigeons, the history of pigeons. It's a history podcast, and it was very entertaining. So yeah, do yourself a favour if you haven't heard of that podcast. Maybe give it a go.
I haven't listened to as many episodes as you have, of course, but I do enjoy the brevity that they approach history with. But also, I'm so surprised how quickly they get all the information together
They're really
in
good.
one go to produce. Is it weekly? The podcast?
Oh, sometimes a couple a week.
Yeah. How do they
Yeah.
get so much
That's
information?
all they do. I mean, there's no. I mean, they're authors, they're writers, they're researchers. That's their full-time gig. So,
But
yeah.
they find such interesting stuff. Eh?
Oh yeah. Yep.
It's always fascinating to hear about history for me. Tim, do you have a favourite episode you've listened to so far on rest is history?
Well, the pigeon one was quite entertaining. The other one that was quite entertaining was I can't remember the exact name. Worst parties in history or something like that.
Oh, right.
Most disastrous parties of history, and it gets quite outrageous. Different 5 top.
The other
parties.
one on a serious note was the history of the Cathars, that was a really sad story about the turmoil in the Christian church in France back in the day, I think early Middle Ages or something. It was a very sad episode. So yeah, they do some really good stuff too. Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting things about how Christianity is part of history and all that.
Well, it's interesting because they're not Christians, but they're very sympathetic to Christianity, and both of them really like the effects that Christianity's had on the West, and so that's kind of refreshing. So it's good.
Yep. Well, I'll send the email. We'll see what we can do.
It'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. And this is the first time that you guys have been on together since what you called a punch-up, Stu, before we recorded. We'll say a verbal punch-up, and I don't think it was...
The actual podcast itself was a intellectual stoush between Tim and I.
Oh, wow.
It was
I
very...
like that.
Do you like that?
Yeah, intellectual stoush. Not
yeah.
bad. But you're a little bit further down the road of your PhD, Stu.
Well, because of Tim, actually. I think I was being lazy, and Tim's kind of got me to think a bit deeper, and I think Tim was right, yeah. So well done, Tim.
Why was Tim highlighting your laziness, as you've termed it?
He did. I think I was being a bit lazy and not thinking deeply enough. Well, I've been away for a couple of weeks, and in the couple of weeks I've been away, did go to River Convention, but also spent some more time on my PhD. And those of you that might have tuned into the episode about 3 weeks ago, I think, we were talking about the strategic approach of youth ministry by Mark Center out of the book called 4 Views of Youth Ministry. And if you're not interested in youth ministry, don't tune out, because the great thing about that book is it suggests that how you set up your youth ministry, or in other words, how you pass on the gospel to the next generation, affects dramatically the whole of your church. So I think it's a really good thing for people not just to compartmentalise youth ministry as another category of ministry, but to actually think of it as a holistic part of how they do church. So anyway, in the book, as a brief reminder, there's 4 different intellectuals that present 4 really captivating visions of youth ministry for the 21st century. So it was written at the turn of the century, and about 20 years ago, but it's a real seminal work, right? So you've got a guy called Milan Nell from South Africa who writes an inclusive congregational approach up in the book, and that is an argument that says that rather than young people being on the periphery of our congregations, they should be at the centre of our life together in everything that we do, and he calls that the inclusive congregational. Wesley Black presents an idea of youth ministry and kids ministry as a specialised ministry, to do it well, to bring kids up to be the future church leadership, and he puts a chapter down on that. There's a guy called Chap Clark. All these names are luminaries in the history of youth ministry. Well, Chap Clark puts a chapter down arguing that we really need to do more in mission in youth ministry, and I think that is a really interesting call for us today, as the other 2 are as well, particularly as we've really focused on discipleship a lot, particularly in our area in the world, in Sydney Diocese, in Sydney Anglican Diocese. I think it's great we've done so much discipleship, but I think that whole idea of mission is assumed that we'll get on with mission. I think we could do more with talking about that. So that chapter kind of brings up some interesting thoughts. And the final chapter by Mark Center III, who's the editor of the book, general editor, he puts down this chapter on the strategic approach. And the strategic approach in broad brushstrokes is simply a youth ministry that forms an intergenerational community of leaders and youth so that the kids are actually involved in leadership as teenagers and grow into that more and more as they get older and more mature. But they also get lots of say, and they're actually preparing to do something quite dramatic in the strategic approach. The idea is that the youth pastor will be sent out by the church to plant a new church with his youth leaders and his youth. Excuse me. So the youth minister takes the youth leaders and the youth sent out by the church, by the way, because the idea is that cultural change is so significant that Centre's sort of suggesting that short of a revival, there's nothing you can do to overcome the cultural differences between younger people and older people. And because older people don't really start listening to young people until they get into their 30s, the solution is we'll let them start a new church for their culture, in their culture. And the phrase he uses is that they can plant a new church that carries on the theological connectedness of the mother church, but plants a new expression that is true to Christ and culture. So that's the strategic approach. Now, over the years, we've been trying to work out where does Soul Revival fit in those four different views of youth ministry. And of course, there's other people have said other things subsequent to that book about other models, but we've just kept thinking that maybe we fit in as a bit of a different model that sort of covers different aspects of all four of those different areas. But a couple of weeks ago, I was quite dramatic when Tim wasn't on the podcast, and I said, actually, I think I've made a mistake. I think we are the strategic approach. Because even though we were an unwilling participant in the strategic approach, what happened to us is that after 20 years of ministry at Guymer Anglican, after Matt and I resigned from Guymer, there was a sense that Guymer Anglican wanted to continue to pursue the homogeneous unit principle, which separated generations out into different services. And we had been experimenting over the last 20 years with trying to bring everyone back together again. But in the end, the church did say, actually, we don't want to change beyond this point, and we want to use the homogeneous unit principle. So we resigned, and after we resigned, the Bishop of Wollongong, Peter Hayward, invited us to plant a church in the Sutherland Shire that was an intergenerational church. And we had the blessing of Guymer Anglican Church, who gifted us 30 people to go and help plant the church. And those 30 people were fundamentally, mostly people who were leaders in the youth ministry. So we actually unwillingly and not unwillingly, but we never planned on planting a new church. But we ended up planting a new church under those circumstances. So my little light bulb moment a couple of weeks ago was, I think we actually, even though we never intended to be, I think we are the strategic approach. Well, the week after, Tim, you came along and said, no, that's not right. We're a different model to the strategic approach. So
I wasn't so blunt in that, though.
Well, offline, he kind of was very clear. He said,
tone it down for the audience.
He was quite clear. I was really clear on Tim's position in no uncertain terms. He was very polite, and as he always is, very genuinely friendly, but very clear. And so, yeah, I just spent a week thinking about it and writing and doing a lot more thought on that, because I am writing a PhD on this topic. So, Tim, yeah, thank you for your pushback. It was really good, and Joel for facilitating that conversation. It was really helpful. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at with my thinking, that I don't think we are the strategic approach. But what I am thinking is, of the four models, the strategic approach is the only one that suggests a church plant, using youth ministry for church planting. Mm-hmm. And Tim made the point that maybe it is a good idea, if a church wants to plant a church, that they could use their youth. But maybe it's not a standard model for youth ministry that would work across the board. So that's got me thinking that Soul Revival has developed, I suppose, over a number of years, the shock absorber effect. And the idea of the shock absorber is that it's more optimistic than Centre's strategic approach, that the shock absorber says the church can change and grow. And in fact, as the church is trying to come to grips with changing culture, there can be a conversation within the local church between the generations about how we can work together to make changes, that the young people bring their flexibility and the older people bring their strength. And just like a shock absorber of a car needs to be flexible and strong, the older people are the strength and the younger people give that opportunity to respond to change really well. So that's where I think I've come to in the last couple of weeks, which is really exciting, actually. I'm really thankful for the two of you to help me to think that through. It was good.
That was cool that we brought it on the podcast. Tim, how is Stu playing down? How aggressive were you in your points
I wasn't aggressive.
I didn't
quite harmonious. And
well, we noticed that one of your
bit of fun with
strengths. I think you've told me that's one of your strengths on the Strengths Finders test.
Yeah, the Strength Finder, harmony is my top strength.
No.
Apparently, I just want everyone to be friends. But I did push back, on that one. But equilibrium has been restored to the force, so I'm happy with that.
Equilibrium.
No, it's I think I think this is great, and it's great to continue to challenge our thinking and to keep putting our approach under the spotlight. And as deeper thinking happens on other levels, or as new ideas come up, it's great to be able to pressure test our model and to see, okay, well, what is going on here? And I think the way in which Soul Revival Church was planted was a pressure test to the system. And I think, as Stuart has said, and we've said it a couple of times over the last number of episodes, that sort of accidentally became the strategic approach, even though it wasn't the intention. And for me, I think that was the biggest difference, was that it looks from the surface as if we enacted the strategic model. However, the point of the 4 views of youth ministry is they're each advocating for their position as youth ministry should aspire to be like this. And I think that's where, for me, the alarm bells start ringing, because I don't think the strategic approach is what we should advocate youth ministries to do. Because if you're advocating for that, you're saying the best possible outcome for a youth ministry is to grow up and develop a relational discipleship model with the leaders and kids that then bud off and intentionally start a new church. And if you're putting that forward as your primary model, you're saying every youth, a good, healthy, effective youth ministry should be striving to do this. And I think that's the biggest difference, is that the shock absorber is not advocating for the budding off of youth ministry from the parent church. And a large part of that is because we are a lot more optimistic about the ability for the young people and the mature or older people in the church to actually be that shock absorber together, to be the flexibility and the strength. Whereas Centre's model presupposes that generational gaps are insurmountable, and that because they're insurmountable, don't worry about trying to change what exists. That will just be frustrating. And so therefore bud off, and that will be the most missionally effective, most discipleship effective for those young people, rather than continue to be frustrated by a church that doesn't listen to them until they're 30. And so, I think that's where I was coming down. As we talked about this, and Stu and I talked on the phone during the week, that was become even more clear to me that as someone who does go around to other churches and visits other churches, and particularly more in children's ministry than youth ministry, but I am optimistic about intergenerational ministry. I am optimistic about the ability for different generations to have mutual and reciprocal relationships where there is mutual benefiting, where young people can learn from old and old people can learn from young, which only happens if you're intentionally bringing the generations together, where the strategic approach is intentionally separating. So the difference, I think, where we came to last time Stu and I were here on the podcast together, was the realisation for me that if you are seeking to plant a church, then doing it with a significant number of people who have ministered alongside each other for a long time, have your theology, your strategy and practice in alignment, that makes a really healthy church plant. So I do understand that the strategic approach provides a good model for church planting, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is a strategy that you want to be advocating for. Every effective youth ministry should be striving towards this.
No, it's interesting. Stu, you were just sharing us earlier that you wrote about 8,000 words approximately for the beginning of your PhD. do you see doing this PhD as another pressure test like Tim was talking about, to just how we think about ministry?
I mean, I think it's really good, because one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is we're really keen to have an open conversation with the world of youth ministry and church planting and ministry in general, and indeed just being a Christian in the 21st century. And that open conversation is really healthy, I think, because it actually doesn't mean that we just end up working within a little bubble and never testing and questioning what we do. So this PhD is another form of that, which will be peer reviewed down the track and actually result in papers and things like that. So I think it's just testing these ideas as best we can, trying to find out what are the principles that are helpful in what we're doing, and just really hoping that people can feel free to cherry pick our ideas and pick the things that they like and leave the things they don't. So it's about sharing some of the things we've learnt from mistakes and some of the things we've learnt through good things, and that also gives us an opportunity to learn from other people too, because as Tim and I were engaging in that conversation about strategic ministry, I learnt a lot from that as a result. So yeah, I find that really fun.
That's cool. And you also shared, and this is kind of we talk about cultural artifacts and different things, but you said there was something by Patrick White that really helped you kind of clarify some of the things you were talking about in the PhD? Yeah,
well, one of the things about the PhD is you start with a setting of the PhD. So the Sutherland Shire is where we planted Soul Revival Youth Ministry in 1992, and it's where we planted our first church in 2012 in the Sutherland Shire. So I've just done a bit more background reading into the Sutherland Shire and just what do other people think about the Sutherland Shire. And one of the big themes of the Sutherland Shire is that it's on the edge of Sydney, and it was quite geographically distinct from the rest of Sydney for a long time because it was cut off by a river and the bush. And it's kind of, the Sutherland Shire is in the south of Sydney. There's beaches on the one side. On the south there's the Royal National Park, which is the first Australian national park, and it was actually called Royal in 1955 when the Queen came to Australia and gave it that title. And the rivers around it make it a very beautiful area, and it's quite lovely. But when it's also the place of first engagement between the British and the Dharawal people, and that ended quite tragically as Joseph Banks and Captain Cook came ashore at Kurnell on the southern edge of Botany Bay. There was an altercation between the British and some Aboriginal people, and an Aboriginal man was shot in that confrontation. So that's very palpable, and it's part of the history of the Sutherland Shire where we are. And the fact that after the Sutherland Shire was opened up to more migration, the Aboriginal people were moved off their lands. So that was also a very sad story to be reading again. But seeing it was interesting seeing that the British were and then the Australians after them were trying to work out what to do with the Sutherland Shire in some ways, like how to use it, because the ground isn't that arable, and while it is an area where farmers did settle and there were farms put in the Sutherland Shire, it was also a place of great beauty. So interestingly, because it was so isolated, and I think the train didn't come until the turn of the century almost, or in the 1880s, something like that, and then the car bridges came after that in the late 1800s, it might have been 19th century. I'll have to look that part up again. But basically what I'm trying to say is, as each technological connection, the Shire got more people coming to it. But pretty much most of the people who came to the Shire were either farmers at the beginning or they were tourists. And so a lot of people came down for leisure. So the Royal National Park was a big draw card. The beaches down at Cronulla were a draw card. So a lot of people came on holidays. So it was a place that was seen as a place of recreation, and in a way a place of hedonism and consumerism and individualism. And in some ways those things haven't changed since there has been more migration. But the majority of the migration took place after the car bridges came across, and in the second half of the 20th century, as Sydney sprawl started to expand out further and further, the Shire became a cheaper alternative for many people. And so these suburban areas popped up all over the place. So the other big theme of the Sutherland Shire is suburbia. And I've just spent the last week or two thinking, what has been the impact on the churches that are planted in the suburban context? What does it mean to be a suburban area within such a recreational area as a beachside community. And so looking at some of those distinctives got me thinking. I did a bit of looking, but I really love Australian literature, and Patrick White is one of my favourite authors, and he wrote a book called The Tree of Man, which looks into what he calls what we could call frontier suburban areas. And because Sutherland Shire was a latecomer to suburbia, because of the lack of transport, as the bridges were built, Tom Ugley's bridge was the first one, I think, they were able to have people commute to the city for work, and so it became a dormitory suburb of Sydney where people would come to live. And so the nuclear family, the dormitory suburb, late Christendom was a factor on Sutherland Shire. Most people went to church. Sutherland Shire Guymer Anglican Church, when it first started, by 1960 they had 400 children a week coming to Sunday school. So that was kind of part of the culture. But Patrick White looks at suburbia and he says, he looks at it from a more darker point of view, and he's a bit anti-suburban. So what I found really interesting is churches and houses all become a sort of bit of a monocultural in the Shire, but he argues that monoculture is a bit darker because he calls it the colonisation of modernity, because the suburb actually separates people from each other and from the natural environment. So the irony is that the Shire is in a place of great natural beauty, but the whole idea and the essence of suburbia is to locate a person's worldview within the four corners of a little fibro bungalow that they live in with all their technology. And the more technology they get, the more isolated they get from each other. So the motor car was a symbol of individual consumerism. And, Miranda Fair was the first big mall that was built in Sutherland Shire, and after that was a big symbol of commercial consumerism. But what I found, just to finish, is that in the midst of this suburban context, the churches have become very suburban, and people are very individualistic in their worldview of Christianity and a bit consumeristic. And so I looked at that, and to my interest, though, there's been these moments of anti-suburban cultural pushback, I suppose you could say, or counterculturalism within the suburban context. So because of the technology, young people are connected up all over the world. And so when the hippie movement and the youth quake of the 1960s hit, that hit the suburban context as well. And the majority youth culture that came out of that in the Sutherland Shire was the surfing culture. So what was really interesting is that surfing culture, the early surfers were seen, they just thought they were bums who smoked dope and drank and dropped out of society, and a lot of them were in the early days. And basically the surfers were anti-suburban, and in the 70s, the ex-servicemen from the American Army and the American servicemen from Vietnam were coming on furlough to Australia, and when they came to Sydney on furlough, they brought heroin with them. So heroin was a massive impact on the 1970s Sutherland Shire as well amongst the surfing community. But in the midst of that anti-suburban moment, you get the rise of the Christian surfers, and they were the Jesus movement equivalent of the suburban context. And interestingly, the fact that they were ministering to these dropouts and to these countercultural people, the Ministry of Christian Surfers, which basically took the church to the beach and started trying to reach people on the beach because they wouldn't go to church, because there was a big decline in attendances at church in that era. But the Christian surfers themselves became countercultural, and even though they started at Guymer Baptist Church, which is just around the corner here, it's a suburb of Sutherland Shire, they ended up leaving Guymer Baptist Church to start a separate ministry, not a separate church in their case. But that was interesting because it's almost strategic approach that they actually left the church to do their ministry. And I found that fascinating, that then I started asking, is soul revival suburban or is it anti-suburban? Is soul revival culturally relevant, though, as Centre says, or is it actually countercultural? But in being countercultural, is it relevant to the culture of youth and the next generation? So all these questions are starting to swirl around in my head now. So I was pretty keen to share that with you.
Wow, that's interesting. What are you thinking so far, Tim? Do you consider yourself anti-suburban?
Well, I mean, I haven't really thought about those as categories, but the part of my brain that loves sociology is kind of spinning at the moment, just thinking about all the things I now have to read about getting in touch. I mean, the areas of suburbia kind of study that I've looked at previously would be like the Third Place and also Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone type thing, which is all about the loss of community through suburbia, which is has been a significant part of that study. But this idea of anti-suburbia is brand new to me, so I haven't really processed that a lot yet. It's fascinating though to think
Who
about
was that author, Tim?
Robert Putnam, I believe is his name. So Bowling Alone is his most famous book. He's got a number of others, but he is a American sociologist and largely, like Ray Oldenburg, is looking at the same kind of phenomena, the loss of culture and the loss of community in the suburbs. And I don't recall in either of those books this kind of trend that you're talking about in the separation of people from each other. Well, no, that's a strong theme. The separation of people from nature is something new to me that you've raised today, which is interesting.
What's interesting about Christian surfers is there was the surfing subculture amongst young people in the Shire is it connects you with the environment because you surf. Like, it's a really interesting
Getting
thing.
in the ocean and the sand and stuff.
Patrick White said of the suburbs that they're colonising modernity, not meaning colonisation as in 18th century colonisation, but as in industrial way of thinking, colonising people's minds and lifestyles. And he says that, he says a really interesting thing. He says, Patrick White in his book says that suburbia is like a lantana hedge that smells like cat. And I found that phrase so good. Because if you don't know what a lantana hedge is, a lantana plant is a plant that was brought out from Europe to Australia to make nice flowery hedges. And it's very prickly and it smells like cat. It smells terrible. But also the cats were brought out by Europeans too. And two of the most invasive species in Australia are cats and lantana. So they're almost impossible to eradicate in Australia because they just are taking over. And so that's a really interesting thing. There's a lady called Bridget Rooney who's written a book called Suburban Space, the Novel in Australian Modernity. And she unpacks some of Patrick White's themes and looks at the fact that as suburbs are taking over in the 1950s and 60s, they are really setting up a new vision of Australia that is disconnected to the natural environment and actually is in some ways like an invasive species. Yeah, it's a bit of a darker view of suburbia, but
I thought you had something else to say.
Well, I was going to say that I actually think it sort of casts a shadow of what materialism does to the Christian. Because materialism, Jesus says over and over, you can't love God and money. And I'm just wondering about this whole thing that, the Sutherland Shire, jokingly, people from the Shire over the years have even been criticised for this, but they call it God's country because it's so beautiful and it's so rich and wealthy.
Which is often a comment on the natural environment, is the surf, the national park, the rivers. So there is a natural tinge to that.
That's right. And the recreation everyone in the Shire is obsessed with. And also, though, there's this sense of wealth will bring us happiness. Yet, the heroin epidemic in the 70s is a dark moment that shows that money doesn't actually bring happiness. And then in the 90s, when we were ministering in Soul Revival, the Sutherland Shire had the highest rates of youth suicide in the whole world. So materialism doesn't actually bring happiness. So this idea of suburban happiness is challenged by the gospel, and that's where Ian Hussey's research is really interesting as well, that he says that the Bible actually critiques our culture as well as affirms aspects of it. And so that's where I'm going to bring all that Ian Hussey research in a little bit.
I was just thinking that growing up as a teenager in the 90s, there did seem to be a recognition of the darkness of suburbia, and I'm not sure because you're the half generation older again. But if we go back to the 50s and 60s and the post-war, it was the boom of the suburbs as this utopia of this is going to bring happiness, materialism, prosperity, and certainly by the 90s, I'm just thinking about the pop culture that I was listening to, like a lot of the skate punk bands, so The Offspring and Blink-182 and Green Day. A lot of their songs are critiquing suburbia and quite anti-suburbia in the sense that they've realised that this beautiful vision, this utopia that often their boomer parents bought into, has just resulted in youth suicide, it's resulted in divorce, it's resulted in all of these systemic problems. And so there's a couple of really key songs from those bands that are really challenging this notion of suburbia being a utopia and being really anti this vision. And so I think I probably imbibed a little bit of that so that I don't see suburbia this wonderful hope. But also growing up in the Sutherland Shire, which is suburbia, there's also the keeping up with the Joneses kind of pressure as well. So I think I've grown up now with a bit of that tension. There's that tension of, it'd be lovely to have the house in the backyard and the 2.5 kids and the picket fence and the dog in the backyard and all that kind of vision, but also with this real cynicism towards it as well, because I also took on a lot of those 90s adolescent vibes that were coming through pop culture, which was, no, this actually doesn't solve anything. We've got broken homes, we've got broken marriages, we've got broken families, we've got just as much drug use, domestic violence, we've got all of these things going on, and it hasn't actually achieved what our boomer parents thought it was going to achieve.
No, it's interesting, isn't it?
Do you think there was a lot of anger around that, or is it just cynicism?
I think there's anger as well.
Because I think it's like maybe, or may have been another generation after Tim, to a degree, a little bit.
But that half generation,
half generation.
Yeah,
I think that turned into anger, like around my generation.
Yeah,
well, it's interesting. That's when the Cronulla riots were.
Yep.
Yeah,
and it was,
and that was a racist expression of that, but it was anger.
Yeah, it was the year I finished high school.
Yeah, well.
Or the year after I finished high school.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, so one of the best books I've ever read was...
one of the best books I've ever written.
I have 0 in that category. So it's called Nietzsche, Leave Those Kids Alone. And it's a great take on, it's one of the Triple J presenters. He's written this deep philosophical book on... it's based on My Chemical Romance, their big song, which is Black Parade, about Black Parade. And he said he first listened to that song and he realised that it was an epic anthem and that the world had changed when he heard that song. And so he goes into that, but one of the things he details in that book, and the thing that stuck with me most, was he draws out really clearly the distinction between the sort of mid-90s punk to the early 2000s emo, and he draws out the two different philosophical trends that are happening through there. And what stuck in my mind was he talks about how punk music raged against the system, but sought hope on the other side of it. So punk wants to break things in the hope that something else will come out of it. And he said what happened with the emo music, and a lot of this is post 9/11, which we've talked about before, is that all of a sudden the music was just sad and navel gazing. And he traced
even more nihilistic, eh?
More nihilistic, yeah. And he traces this back 200 years. He talks about the Romantics and Mary Shelley, and he goes deep into philosophical history. But he says what happened was that punk music hopes for something on the other side, and emo stops hoping. So emo looks inward and just navel gazes and says the world sucks, so I'm just going to sit here and be sad. And
emo was a subculture, wasn't it? It was
that's right.
Everyone dressed in black and dyed their hair black, and
so you got a lot of punk overtones, you got a lot of goth overtones,
like
but it's very
late 80s,
introspective. Whereas there was a lot of frivolity around skate punk. There was a lot of silliness and fun, and Blink-182 were just jokers that were raging against suburbia, raging against the idealism that their boomer parents had sold for them. But there was still this kind of joviality to it, which the emo didn't have. And I think that was that break that you talked about, Joel, that it turned from let's break things but have fun doing it to let's be angry and sad and destructive. And I think maybe a number of seasons ago we talked about the Woodstock.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Woodstock 99, and how everyone just broke things to the point of burning it down.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, music is always, again, a picture of kind of what's going on in society, and I wasn't thinking so much of the emo genre, but the new metal scene, like I think Rage Against the Machine might have been just before that, but Limp Bizkit is one that I really think of, is that that was the band I really got into in the middle of high school, and probably, you know, at the time spoke to me about how it just felt like there was like, you were told everything was good, but it didn't seem that good. So, but like, and that was where I was thinking of the anger, because a lot of that music had a lot of anger in it.
That's interesting. That's a recurring theme I'm picking up on. The baby boomers rebelled against that in the 60s. Then there was a rebellion against it again in each generation after that. So my generation was kind of a bit more cynical and sad. But yeah, it's picked up by songs like Green Day too. I was thinking of Jesus' Suburbia by Green Day. The lyrics are, "I'm the son of rage and love, the Jesus of Suburbia, the Bible of none of the above, on the steady diet of soda pop and Ritalin.
Wow.
No one ever died for my sins in hell, as far as I can tell, least the ones I got away with." Yeah,
That's
so
interesting.
it's pretty nihilistic.
Devoid of hope, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
But
yeah,
then
that's that
it's
anger
like,
coming out too.
and it's almost like religion's not the answer. They're saying religion's not the answer.
Yeah.
There's no hope for us, so we may as well just do whatever I want.
Well, one thing I'm wondering is, has the suburban modernity colonised the church in such a way that people now think the church stands for suburbia?
Oh, okay.
Because for Green Day, it's like Jesus of Suburbia is pretty blatant, saying that there is a kind of suburban Jesus that is pitched at us. Interesting thought.
Oh, that in terms of materialism, individualism, that's the Jesus that's preached.
A Christianity that combines materialism, individualism, consumerism with...
So you can have the world and you can have Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it conflates the values of the gospel with the values of a middle class suburban identity.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, and that's I think that's a really valid critique. In that it doesn't then challenge the values of a middle class suburbia, and it's also is unattainable for those of lower socioeconomic, and it's also disinterested to those who are of a higher socioeconomic.
It's interesting.
So if you've got these values that are in the middle, then you're actually only going to be evangelising those who are in the middle, who can resonate with those ideas, and you're going to continue to reinforce what is potentially non-gospel values rather than actually critique them with a Jesus ethic.
And that's where Hussey's really helpful for me, because he says the Bible does at some points affirm culture and sometimes
That's right.
critiques culture. So my thought is, with the coming right back to the strategic approach, it's saying that they're going to send out young people to create a modern version of the church that's in line with the culture of the suburb. And even if that culture was countercultural to the earlier generations, there may be a predominance of a continuation of suburban Christianity in that next expression. And I think what we did in the 90s was we were a countercultural moment at Soul Revival, where we consciously thought of ourselves as countercultural, possibly because of our context and the number of surfers that were in the group and stuff, maybe, I don't know. But the idea that we wanted more than just, the suburban house and a car and a dog and a white picket fence and a good job and, go on holidays. Life, there was more to life than that. And one of the big themes we were craving was more community, that, we are reconciled to God and to one another. And what does that look like? Does it look like spending as least amount of time as possible with Christians, so you could also do these other things in your life? And a big pushback for early Soul Revival was we spent too much time together, and some people felt like we were demanding too much time. But the idea of actually spending more time with each other around the Bible was a big theme of our earlier youth ministry that was really popular. And a lot of the young people that came to Soul Revival were from non-church backgrounds that were thrilled to see some kind of stability in their life, because my generation, Gen X, was the first to experience high rates of suicide as well, but high rates of divorce. So 50% of our parents were divorced by the start of the 90s. So there was this cynicism that came from that and anger. So when there's a group of Christians who go, all church is an hour a week, and if you've got time, a Bible study, and if you've got time, help out with the youth group for a couple of years, it just felt shallow, and it felt like a veneer that was over the top of our life. We wanted to go deeper than that and spend more time in community. And I suppose surfers do that. They go for a surf, they hang out on the beach, they spend more time. It's a bit of a time-intensive sport. So maybe it came as a bit of cultural relevance, but also I think there was this sense that some of the conflict we experienced over the years was because we were pushing back on suburbia and didn't really realise we were doing it, I think.
Well, it's just interesting that, Tim, earlier you were talking about the strategic approach and you brought up the leadership moves on, and it's kind of a break in continuity of leadership, and thinking about pitting the shock absorber soul revival model up against the strategic approach. I think that's something you're talking about there, Stu, is that actually continuity was one of the things that really inspired you.
And that's anti-suburban.
Yeah, which really inspired you for to start soul revival and say we're committing to this. And I thought that was an interesting parallel, the fact that I also saw that. We're talking about me growing up in high school before, is that the continuity of leadership just for me personally was like, oh, this is really important for me, and I found tons of value in that as well. So I suppose here's my final question, because Tim, I know you have to go. The final one for you guys to bat around, and you pitched this kind of at the end of the last time you guys had your punch-up that we called it, verbal punch-up. What would you call it? Intellectual stoush?
Intellectual stoush, it wasn't violent at all.
You said, I'm trying to figure out if soul revival is its own model of ministry or more aligned with a strategic approach. Do you think you're any closer to being having a clearer position on that?
Yeah, no, I think that where I think I'm heading is how does the shock absorber compare, and how is it differentiated from the strategic approach. So I've moved away from thinking that there's only one way for youth ministries to plant a church. I think the shock absorber is another way to plant churches, that we could plant more churches using young people, but there would be teams of young people and old people going in those teams, not just young people. Yeah. But they still could be driven by that entrepreneurial flexibility of young people, and have older people in it that were keen not only to listen but to be there to support and encourage the young people as they start those ministries.
Well,
which provides continuity too. And I also think I'm drawn to, which could be for another day, but I'm really drawn to the network church planning idea rather than churches leaving and not being in connection with each other. I've always felt like the hub and spoke model's a lot better way of doing church planning too.
Yeah, cool.
So that's where I'm at.
Yeah.
What about you, Tim?
What about you, Tim?
Yeah, I do think that the shock absorber is significantly differentiated from the strategic approach, so that they are different models of ministry. And yes, while I've said the strategic approach provides a good model of church planning, I think one of the things that we have done with our spokes, each time we send out a new group of people to plan a new gathering as part of the Soul Revival Network, that we have intentionally looked for different generations to be a part of that. So it's not just sending off the young people because they have particular culture which other older generations are not going to be able to understand, and if we include older people there, then it's not going to be as relevant and it's not going to be as meaningful. We're saying no, we're sending out people of many different generations together, and part of our all age, all stage approach is, at the very least, if there's a generation missing, we notice that as a loss. And so we go, it's great that we send this team out, and if there's no one over the age of 70, we're not going to necessarily force someone over the age of 70 to join, but we notice that and we go, wouldn't it be wonderful to grow some elders into this congregation? And if there's no teenagers, we go, wouldn't it be wonderful to think of some ways in which some teenagers may missionally join this, or we can see some teenagers in this. So we're intentionally looking for the different generations, because that's what the shock absorber is doing. And so we're providing that space, and I think that's a lot healthier, and I think that's going to be going to have longevity in terms of how you grow faith deeply in intergenerational relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
What about you, Joel? What are you thinking?
I think from the last time we talked about it, I was like, I think soul revival or the shock absorber, whichever way you want to term it, is probably its own way of doing ministry. And I think inherent in that shock absorber model is picking up different ideas from other places and trying to use them as best, working in the current context it's in. I think that's where I eventually came to, and from listening to you and Tim talk about it last time we were talking about it. But yeah, that's what I think. And I think you often have had to explain that a lot to people that maybe don't understand it, or you're just introducing the idea. And I think that's the reason that we do this on this podcast, is to show that actually the continuity that we kind of talked about, or the longevity that Tim spoke about, comes from continually challenging the ideas. And I think the what did you call it? Pressure test. So we welcome the pressure tests in order to make sure we are continually challenging the ways we are thinking about ministry in order to serve God as best as possible. I think that's where I've come to.
It's awesome.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think also, just on the point that Tim was saying about looking at our other gatherings, is that another idea that you've introduced to us today, so we can talk about it next episode, was what about those gatherings having youth groups, and do they help grow the church, and is that a good idea to do? So I think
how important are those youth groups? Yeah,
how
I think
important
they're important
to growing. And as going all the way back to the start of what you said about the 4 views of youth ministry, is how you think about youth ministry also shapes how you think about how you do church as a whole, in a holistic sense. So I think that's probably a good leaving off point for this episode, but a good starting point for the next episode.
Sounds great.
It's really good, actually.
It's been a really fun discussion. Thank you very much to the both of you. And thank you to everyone listening or watching. If you have any questions and want to add to the discussion, as we would very much welcome you to, you can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. And thank you very much to Ek, our producer, as always, who puts together all our episodes every time. Does a great job. Has them ready to go by Monday, even though they're coming out on Wednesday and Friday, the next in the following week. So thank you very much to Ek, and thank you to Stu and Tim, as always. And we finish with one way.
One way.